Previously on KSP2, we start our walk back to the ship, and as I got closer, things didn't look right. Oh no. Houston, we have a problem. This time on KSP2, we're saving Valentina, guys. So just keeping track of the assets we have from the last mission. We have Valentina in a capsule on Duna, and then we have a tanker above her in orbit around Duna, the original return vehicle, which still should be viable as our primary return vehicle. So we're going to be using the same capsule build as we did for Valentina's original launch. Two reasons for this. One, it works. There's no reason to mess with something that works consistently and should work effectively. Second of all, the return craft was built based on that weight. If we make it any larger or any heavier, the return vessel's going to really struggle to try and make it all the way back to Kerbal properly. After an additional RCS tank, we're going to add in more fuel so that we can do more maneuvers with this stage, as well as additional parachutes to make it easier to land on Duna. So then underneath the main ship, we're going to put the stages that are going to be responsible for taking us interplanetary. We want to have extra fuel once we get there, so we're going to have a drop tank that adds a little bit extra oomph on our way out. At the center, we've got ourselves a Poodle engine because I just absolutely love the Poodle engines. And then on both sides, we've got Skipper engines for a little bit more thrust, but a little bit lower fuel efficiency. Underneath that, then, we technically put our last set of stages that will be responsible for leaving atmosphere. Then on either side, we add additional liquid boosters to make sure that we can get up and out of atmosphere efficiently. Then I add on some solid boosters to the staging to make sure that when we separate, they don't collide into the craft as it sails away. Couple of fins for additional guidance in atmosphere. And we're set to go. So just like all of the other crafts, whenever we can, we try to launch towards the 90 or the eastern direction, and the ideal angle you want to be going for is about 45 degrees from the horizon line by about 10,000 meters roughly. Then we drop all of our accessory tanks. Now we're just trying to raise our apoapsis, seen in the bottom left of the screen, to above 70,000 meters. Then we switch to the upper interplanetary stage. This stage is going to finish our orbitalizing as well as take us to Mars. Then we do one last orbitalizing burn to get ourselves a nice circular orbit around Kerbal. Now we set our target as Duna, and we attempt to hit it with a maneuver node. Now, as I brought up in the last video, the best transfer window from Kerbal to Duna and vice versa is when Duna is about 45 degrees ahead of Kerbal. That's roughly the best window. And I actually got really lucky with this transfer and got it lined up on the first shot. I was so lucky here. So then we line ourselves up and we do a 10-minute burn. First emptying out the skipper tanks on the boosters and then dropping those, then transferring over to just the Poodle engine. Once we gotten pretty close, I decided to cancel the original burn and move over to doing an adjustment burn. Considering that I was burning for about 10 minutes, I had a little bit of deviation that I needed to correct for. And as discussed previously in the last Duna video, a little adjustment burn now, 60 delta V, can save you thousands later. It's very much worth tuning it in. Cheap adjustment of 125 delta V, super duper cheap. So, after our adjustment burn, we then disable SAS on the craft. It doesn't have a lot of solar panels, and keeping the control wheels live for the entire trip to Duna is not only useless, but a huge power drain. We'd end up showing up on the other side without any power. Normally when I use the control wheels, it's right before I fire the engines, and the engine's alternators make power back for me and end up not draining the batteries, but leaving the device on SAS for this entire trip is completely useless, so instead I turned it off to save power. We don't need a maneuver node for this, we just need the little orbit box on the left side bottom of the screen to go down in meters per second. We need to go a lot slower than we currently are. Then we drop our interplanetary stage, and we move on to the final set of engines. I had a little bit of a glitch with the decoupler though, as the tanks did not want to let go of each other, so I just sped up time until they moved away relatively from one another. Now that we've gotten ourselves in orbit around Duna, we're going to slowly bring ourselves closer and closer to the planet, while also adjusting our angle. We need a much steeper angle than the clean, flat one we came in on, because of the position of our target for landing. We would end up just going around the equator over and over again, while Valentina is much closer to the North Pole. Now, I did a little bit of restaging with my parachutes here to make sure that not all of them would deploy. I kept the upper stage from deploying just so it would be easier when we got back to Kerbal later. It just took a second because none of them are labeled. Now we're just waiting for our transfer window between the landing site and our current orbit. Eyeballing it to make sure that we adjust for the rotation of the planet as we come down. And right as we get right above our target location, we're going to bring ourselves down at a sharper angle. I tried to get myself as close as possible while still up above the atmosphere in order to avoid dealing with the drag as much as possible. Dropping straight down like a stone doesn't allow the atmosphere to deviate you as far as if you were to come in at a steep slope. Fortunately, I found a nice flat piece of ground barely 2 kilometers away from where Valentina originally landed. So after the parachutes deployed, we did a little bit of power burn to make sure that we had a nice soft landing. And after a little bit of teetering, we got ourselves a stable landing. Now Valentina gets to go for another walk. If you look down at the bottom of the screen, she is at T plus 9 years. Her mission's been going for nearly a decade, and she's finally getting to go home now. Just a few monopropellant hops over, and boom, we're at the craft. And fortunately, this time, the game didn't glitch it into the ground. And now that she's on board, we're gonna get the heck out of here. We're gonna launch off the planet's surface with the main target of this to be hitting a rendezvous with the original return vehicle. This craft we're in right now does not have enough Delta V after doing a landing and a launch to get out of the Duna system anymore. But we can deliver it to a craft that can. We can deliver Valentina to her original return vehicle and finish her mission. A lot of the time when it comes to these rendezvous, the best option is to just play with the maneuver node. Ideally, you try to get yourself close to the individual crafts, and then you try to cancel out the difference in their Delta V with an additional burn. That's normally how I end up eyeballing this stuff. So now we're setting ourselves up with a rendezvous maneuver. So now that we're closing in, I changed the point of reference for speed calculations for the ship. Normally, a lot of those calculations are based on whatever planet you're around, you know, whether you're on the surface or whether you're in orbit. There's orbital calculations as well as surface calculations. But there's a third thing you can do, which is target calculations. It will tell you the relative speed between you and the target craft that you have selected, or target body that you have selected. So in this situation, we're using it to figure out exactly where we want to do our braking burn and how much. Then after a little bit more manual adjustment, we've got ourselves set up for a rendezvous at about 10,000 meters separation. While I'm slowing myself down, I'm also trying to point my prograde to be in line with my target marker. This will mean that any additional speed that I have will actually go towards bringing me closer to my target. Now, the original plan with this craft, as I stated earlier in the video, was if we had any additional fuel, we were going to drain it from this craft to the return craft to get a little bit of extra oomph out of the return craft. But we're essentially running on fumes right now. There's nothing left in this tank except for enough to maybe do one orbital adjustment at some point. So we're going to change up the plan a little bit here. We're going to do things a little bit more creatively. So now that we're within 100 meters of the target craft, we're going to cancel out any of our relative speed. make ourselves absolutely still in comparison to the other ship, and we're going to set everything for targeting for docking, almost like we were doing a normal docking maneuver. Now, normally at this point, you would turn on RCS and push one of the crafts towards the other, but instead we're going to use Newton's laws. By activating the decoupler that holds Valentina's pod to the craft, we're able to push the craft behind us and push the pod forward. So without RCS, we're essentially performing a toss in space, almost like a football pass or something. But this football is a capsule that contains Valentina. So with no maneuvering, no RCS necessary, we just free float through space to the docking port. I am absolutely so proud of how that ended up. No RCS was expended at all to do the ship-to-ship transfer, and now Valentina is on her final craft on her way home, in an almost identical configuration to what the original plan was as well. So now, let's take her home. Now we're bringing ourselves into one of those transfer windows again, making it so that Duna is just roughly 45 degrees ahead of Kerbin's position currently. So, because of our extreme orbit, I had to pull on the nav ball a little bit, but I did manage to get a capture around Kerbin that I can use, and then once we get there, we'll do our normal braking burn. So we overshot a little bit with the burn, so I ended up having to add a maneuver node. And then we did a little bit of an adjustment burn again, just to make sure that we're directly on target. There we go, with only 2 meters per second of adjustment, we've got ourselves a great intercept. I tried to get something a little bit more optimal, but after a little bit of messing with it, I realized I wasn't going to get anything better. So then we get back around Kerbin and we do our braking burn. So by burning out the last of the fuel the craft had, we just barely got our capture around Kerbin proper. We had 50 meters per second of delta V left. So after doing our braking burn and getting ourselves a periapsis that will allow us to atmospherically brake down to the surface, we had 6 meters per second of delta V left. Talk about clean precision. Talk about not having safety margins on the fuel tanks too. If one thing had gone even slightly differently, Valentina would have been afloat in space for longer. Then we just empty out the remainder of the fuel tanks and the RCS tanks. Not because we need it, but it's not going to do any good for us anymore, so we might as well expend it here. I'm really happy we didn't have to end up using the RCS nearly as much as I anticipated. It's always good to have a little bit extra left over. So right before we disconnect, we then top up the RCS on the small pod to make sure that it's completely full, because the other tank's about to explode when it hits the atmosphere. So again, completely useless after this point. But now that we've got full RCS control and the pod's got its heat shield ready, we should be set to coast right through the atmosphere, coming in hot like a meteor. We get our parachute deployment. It was at this point I realized we were still in reverse control, so I flipped the control ball back around so it looked normal. And then we just sailed right down into the ocean. After over 10 years in space, Valentina can finally come home. And there's a reason why this was so important. Valentina has been the first Kerbal to set foot on every single planetary body. And the next mission we're going on, we need her to set foot on a new one. So now with proper splashdown, Valentina gets to go home, we get to recover her, and very shortly, she's going back out into space for an even longer mission. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed everything you saw. If you did, maybe sauce me an interaction down below, leave a like, maybe leave me a comment of other things you want to see, whether it be KSP1, KSP2, or any other game, love to see it. And maybe check out the video that's being recommended to you right now. YouTube thinks it's good for you, so maybe it is. Have a great one.